The village of Little Brackley prided itself on being the sort of place where nothing unexpected ever happened. Dawn came faithfully at 5:30 in summer. The post arrived with clockwork precision, and the roses in the vicarage garden bloomed on schedule, as though they, too, understood the value of proper English order. Even the gossip, abundant though it was, tended to follow familiar paths, looping around the same agreeable topics, like a well-behaved cat circling a hearth. On the morning the trouble began, Mrs. Judith Faversham was fussing over the final preparations for her annual midsummer garden breakfast, a tradition as cherished as it was mildly dreaded. Most villagers attended out of habit, admiration, or the desire to compare one another's scones. Few dared disappoint her. Her lawn, sweeping, immaculate, and considerably larger than any one widow reasonably needed, was set with crisp white tables. The smell of warm pastries drifted on the pale gold air. Miss Marple arrived precisely on time. She walked with slow, careful steps along the gravel path, pausing now and then to admire Mrs. Faversham's delphiniums, which had grown surprisingly tall that year. Though her silver hair was tucked neatly under a straw hat, her blue eyes missed nothing: the faint scrape on the sundial, the neglected rake leaning against the hedge, the way Mrs. Faversham kept glancing toward the western gate as though hoping someone, or fearing someone, might come through it. "Miss Marple, do come in," Judith called, her voice overly bright. "You've chosen the loveliest morning to join us." "It is a pleasant one," Miss Marple agreed gently, folding her hands before her, "though the clouds suggest there may be a change later." Judith gave a distracted laugh. "Oh, let us hope not. We have enough to manage without a storm, don't we?" Others were already scattered about the garden. Major Leonard Ashbury retired from the army, but retaining the stiff posture and clipped conversation of a man still commanding troops. Clara Prowse, the young schoolmistress with a fondness for intellectual debate and an unfortunate inability to hide her emotions. Mr. Hector Billing, owner of the village antiquities shop, whose knowledge of local history was matched only by his serenity at charging double what anything was worth. And Edwin Faversham, Judith's stepson, visiting unexpectedly that week, who lingered near the refreshment table with a manner both restless and oddly triumphant. Breakfast had scarcely begun when the tranquility cracked. It happened shortly after 7:30, just as the sun climbed above the elms, sending narrow shafts of light across the tablecloths. A shriek cut through the air, a sharp, startled sound, not loud, but unmistakably real. Every head turned. It came from the orchard path behind the garden. Mrs. Faversham went pale. Oh dear, what now?" She stared toward the trees, but made no move to approach. Major Ashbury strode forward immediately. Clara Prowse gasped and followed at a cautious distance, while Edwin merely watched, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple, silent and steady, walked after them, the soft crunch of gravel beneath her shoes seeming far less dramatic than the trembling in the air. At the end of the path, they found Lydia Harper, the Faversham maid, standing rigid with both hands clamped over her mouth. Her apron was damp with morning dew. Her cheeks were streaked with tears. "There's someone lying there," she whispered. "I thought it was Mr. Edwin's coat at first, left out overnight, but... Miss Marple stepped forward with a firmness that belied her years. Just beyond the apple trees, half hidden by the long grass and the low stone wall, lay the body of a man very much dead. The villagers froze, the moment hanging fragile and cold. "What? Who is it?" Clara managed through trembling lips. Major Ashbury knelt, but even he hesitated before turning the body slightly, revealing the white, unseeing face. Mrs. Faversham gasped. Her knees seemed to fail her. Edwin caught her arm with surprising quickness. It's Dr. Lionel Forsyth," the major declared grimly. "Shot. From the look of it. Not long ago either." A ripple of horror passed through the group. Dr. Forsyth, pillar of the community, genial, respectable, universally trusted, lay still in the grass as though the dawn itself had struck him down. Miss Marple did not gasp or cry out. She merely reached for the parasol she had set aside when she approached. As she picked it up, her eyes traveled from the wound to the man's shoes, to the flattened patch of grass beside him, to the orchard gate slightly ajar. Nothing in her face betrayed her thoughts. Behind them, Lydia Harper began sobbing softly. Mrs. Faversham clung to Edwin. Clara stood rooted, shocked beyond speech. And somewhere within that quiet garden, where butterflies still drifted and breakfast scones cooled in the morning light, a murder had taken place, neatly, deliberately, and with a motive yet unseen. Miss Marple folded her hands. "Such a tragic thing," she murmured, "and on so lovely a morning." But her gaze, sharp as polished glass, was already gathering the first threads of a pattern no one else yet recognized. For a few long seconds no one moved. Even the birds seemed to have given up their morning chatter, as though the sight of Dr. Forsyth's body had silenced them as surely as the bullet had silenced him. It was Major Ashbury who recovered first. Years of dealing with emergencies on hot, confusing battlefields perhaps made a grim corpse in an English orchard easier to face than for most. "We must send for the police," he said, standing and brushing his knees, his face set. "And no one is to touch anything. Do you understand? No one at all." His eyes flicked toward Lydia, who nodded miserably, still clutching her apron. Mrs. Faversham was breathing in short, sharp bursts, her lips pale. "The telephone is in the morning room," Miss Marple said gently. "Perhaps Major Ashbury would be so good as to call the station. I believe Inspector Graves is the name." The Major gave a curt nod and strode back toward the house. Clara, who had not stopped staring at Dr. Forsyth's face, swallowed hard and looked away, as though by refusing to see him she might somehow undo what had happened. How could this be?" she murmured. "Dr. Forsyth, of all people. He was only at the school yesterday. He spoke to the children about clean hands and healthy lungs." Her voice shook and then broke entirely. Miss Marple laid a light, steadying hand on the young woman's arm. "Death seldom inquires whether a person is kindly or useful before choosing them," she said, "though I dare say the choice may have been made by someone very human indeed." Edwin Faversham, who had thus far said little, cleared his throat. "Perhaps we ought to get my stepmother back to the house," he suggested. "This cannot be good for her nerves." Mrs. Faversham made a faint protest, but it lacked conviction. Edwin guided her away, his hand firm at her elbow. Miss Marple watched them go with a mild smile that did not reach her eyes. It was interesting, she thought, how quickly Edwin had moved to support Judith, and how very calm he seemed for a man who had just stumbled across a murder at his own garden party. Around them, the guests who had lagged behind in the main garden began drifting closer, drawn by curiosity and fear in equal measure. Hector Billing arrived with a slightly breathless air, his spectacles askew. "What's this I hear?" he demanded, lowering his voice only after the first indignant sentence. "Lydia ran past me as though the devil himself were after her, babbling about the orchard." He saw the body then and stopped. His hand went automatically to the pocket where he kept his handkerchief, as if a respectable man ought to have something between himself and such an ugly fact. "Good Lord," he whispered. "Forsyth." By the time Major Ashbury returned from the house, having telephoned the police with clipped efficiency, the garden was buzzing. Voices fluttered like disturbed sparrows, rising and falling as questions overlapped. When did anyone last see him? Didn't he have an early round of calls? Could it have been an accident? A gun, going off, by mistake? Don't be ridiculous. Look at him. That is not what an accident looks like. Miss Marple stood a little apart from the clusters of whispering villagers. Her eyes wandered, not just over the body, but along the path by which they had come. The gravel showed fresh disturbances, but that was hardly surprising with so many feet passing over it that morning. The orchard grass was beaded with dew, and in one patch near Dr. Forsyth's right hand, the dew had been brushed away. There were tiny specks of darker earth there, as though something had pressed into the ground and been lifted again. A walking stick, perhaps, or a shoe. She did not stoop to examine it more closely. That would come later, if it came at all. For now, the important thing was to watch people rather than footprints. Footprints might be made to lie. People seldom could, at least not for long. The police arrived 20 minutes later. A motor car from the nearby market town, bearing Inspector Graves and a young constable who looked as though he still thought of murder as something that primarily happened in penny novels. Graves was a solid man with a graying mustache and a manner that suggested he viewed most things, including crime, as tiresome interruptions to reasonable routine. He listened to Major Ashbury's concise account, nodded once, then moved to the body with professional briskness. Miss Marple observed him with quiet approval. Graves was not brilliant, but he was not foolish. That could be a very good combination if one were inclined to be helpful. "Shot at fairly close range," Graves murmured after a brief inspection. "Chest, no sign of the weapon nearby. Rigor hasn't set in. I'd say he's been dead less than an hour. Perhaps rather less than that." "Then he might have been killed while we were here at breakfast," Clara said, horrified. "Or just before you came out," Graves answered. "That will be one of many details we shall have to ascertain. Dr. Forsyth was expected here this morning?" Mrs. Faversham, who had been brought back by Edwin at the inspector's request, nodded. "He was to attend," she said faintly. "I invited him, of course. Everyone in the village knows our midsummer breakfast, but I hadn't seen him yet. I thought perhaps he had been delayed on his rounds." Graves turned his gaze toward the western gate, which still hung slightly open. "Does that lead on to the lane?" "Yes," said Judith. "The back lane that runs to the village square. Tradesmen use it sometimes." "And was it customary to keep it unlocked?" "I suppose so. I hadn't thought about it." Graves grunted and sent the constable to secure the area around the body. Guests were moved back toward the main lawn with firm, polite insistence. Lydia was taken into the house to sit down with a strong cup of tea that she did not drink. On the lawn, gossip sprouted as quickly as weeds in neglected soil. Hector Billing had made himself the chief recipient and distributor of information, though he pretended reluctance. "Terrible business," he kept saying. "Terrible. Of course nobody wishes to speculate. It would be in the poorest taste. Still, one can't help thinking. There were those who disliked Forsyth." "Oh," murmured Miss Marple, who had come to stand by the tea table, ostensibly contemplating a plate of untouched scones. Billing jumped slightly. He had not noticed her approach. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there. Yes, well, perhaps dislike is too strong a word. But you know how people resent a man who interferes. He was very firm about certain things. Bills being paid on time, practices at the surgery. He could be quite sharp-tongued." "Doctors sometimes must be," Miss Marple said mildly. "For the patient's good, of course." Hector's eyes flicked toward Edwin Faversham, who stood a little away from the others, staring toward the orchard with a furrowed brow. "Still," Hector continued, lowering his voice, "he and Mr. Edwin did not always see eye to eye, I believe. Something to do with the will or the estate. One hears things, you know." "One always does in villages," Miss Marple agreed. "It is one of their chief characteristics." She tucked that remark away with several others. The quickness with which Hector had moved to mention Edwin, the way Clara Prowse hovered on the edge of every group as though she longed to hear everything and yet hated herself for listening. The pale little flinches in Mrs. Faversham's expression whenever Dr. Forsyth's name was spoken. Inspector Graves, having arranged for the body to be removed in due course, called the principal guests together. "I shall need statements from those present this morning," he announced. Major Ashbury, Miss Prowse, Mr. Billing, Mr. Faversham, Mrs. Faversham, and the maid Lydia Harper. We'll start with those who discovered the body. We shall, of course, do everything to assist you, Major Ashbury said. Little Brackley may be a quiet place, but we are not accustomed to running away from unpleasantness. No, Miss Marple thought, watching the small crowd. Villagers don't run away from unpleasantness. They swallow it down and pretend it was nothing at all, but it never quite digests, you know. It has a way of surfacing again, rather like this. Inspector Graves turned to her with a courteous inclination of his head. You were present as well, Miss Marple. I've heard your name. St. Mary Mead, isn't it? Visiting? Yes, Inspector, she replied with a small, self-effacing smile. Just a quiet guest at a charming breakfast. I'm afraid I cannot be of much use. I only saw, well, what everyone else has seen. Graves, who had spent enough years in country districts to know that elderly ladies saw quite a lot, made a mental note to speak to her more fully later. For the moment, the garden emptied slowly, like a theatre after an unexpected tragedy. The guests left in little groups, their voices dropping as they reached the lane, their minds already busy reconciling this violent intrusion with their idea of Little Brackley. Miss Marple lingered a little, offering to help Mrs. Faversham with the distressing business of untasted food and overturned chairs. Such a dreadful cloud over your lovely morning, she said softly. But it is in such clouds, I have always thought, that shapes begin to show themselves if one only looks carefully enough. Judith stared at her, perhaps not understanding, perhaps understanding too well. Somewhere in the house, Edwin raised his voice sharply to a maid, then lowered it again. The clatter of cups echoed faintly. Outside, in the orchard, the dew was already beginning to dry, and with it, perhaps, some of the clearer marks that had been left upon the earth. But the impressions made upon the hearts and minds of Little Brackley's residents, that Miss Marple knew would remain very sharp indeed. And people, under sharp impressions, did the strangest things. Inspector Graves conducted the initial interviews in the morning room, a space that still smelled faintly of lavender polish and the scones that had never been served. Miss Marple did not linger long there. She had offered her account politely, simply, leaving out none of the facts, but also none of the impressions she felt too delicate to press upon a man who preferred tangible details. When she stepped out into the hallway, she found the atmosphere of the Faversham house much altered from earlier that morning. The sense of festivity had vanished entirely, replaced by an uneasy hush that clung to the wallpaper and dimmed even the sunlight through the windows. Edwin was standing near the staircase, speaking in low, urgent tones to a young maid who looked ready to burst into tears. The moment he saw Miss Marple, he straightened and dismissed the girl with a curt gesture. His expression rearranged itself into something polite, but the tension at the corners of his mouth remained. "This is a ghastly business, Miss Marple," he said. "One hopes the police will make quick work of it. We don't need lingering scandal in Little Brackley." "Oh, scandal seldom lingers longer than people allow it," Miss Marple replied gently. "It is rather like ivy. It creeps until someone cuts it back." Edwin blinked, uncertain whether she was offering comfort or warning. Before he could pursue it, Inspector Graves emerged from the morning room, calling Edwin's name. He gave Miss Marple a stiff nod and went in, shutting the door behind him. Left alone in the hallway, Miss Marple walked a little way toward the back of the house, where the door to the veranda stood open. Outside, the garden lay strangely still. The police had taken the body away, and their departure had stirred a brief flurry of movement among the villagers who had lingered just beyond the gate, hoping for news. Now everyone had retreated to their homes, where curtains would be twitched and conversations carried out in tight whispers. Miss Marple stepped toward the veranda, breathing in the scent of roses warmed by the late morning sun. From there she could see the orchard path, still cordoned off by a rather officious-looking rope that the constable had erected. Beyond it, the patches of flattened grass glinted where the dew had evaporated. She had expected company, though she did not look behind her when Clara Prowse approached, her footsteps soft, uncertain. "I thought perhaps I might find you here," Clara said quietly. "I needed air. I don't know how you can stand to be near the orchard after what we saw." "Air is often clearest where others hesitate to breathe it," Miss Marple replied. "And the orchard is only an orchard, dear. It is not at fault." Clara gave a shaky laugh. "I suppose not. But the sight of him, it keeps replaying every time I close my eyes." Miss Marple turned toward her, taking in the reddened eyelids, the restless fingers twisting the edge of Clara's handkerchief. "It was a shock to you. To all of us." "Yes, to all of us." Clara hesitated. "I didn't know Dr. Forsyth very well, but he always seemed kind enough. Though, perhaps I didn't see him as clearly as others did." "Others?" Miss Marple asked lightly. Clara's gaze dropped. "I heard Mr. Billing talking earlier. He implied that the doctor had enemies. Does that seem possible? In Little Brackley?" "Enemies is a dramatic word," Miss Marple said. "But resentments, little ones, growing unnoticed, that is far more likely. Rather like a thorn hedge left untrimmed." Clara was silent for a moment, her brow creasing. "Do you think this was personal?" "What else could it be?" Miss Marple answered gently. "In small places, crimes seldom come from strangers." The young woman nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. Then, catching herself, she said, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't speculate. Inspector Graves will know what to do." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "He will do what the law requires, but understanding why the law is needed, that often lies in quieter observations." Clara seemed unsure how to respond. Before she could form a reply, the sharp voice of Major Ashbury carried across the lawn. "Miss Prowse, Miss Marple, Inspector Graves requests that no one stray near the cordoned area. Evidence must be preserved." Clara flushed. "Of course, Major. We weren't going any closer." The Major approached briskly. His demeanor was disciplined, but there was a tightness in the line of his jaw that suggested deep unease. "Terrible morning," he said gruffly. "One tries to maintain order, but murder makes a battlefield of any place, no matter how peaceful." Miss Marple inclined her head sympathetically. "Yes, Major. The unexpected always tests us." He looked toward the orchard, his eyes narrowing. Forsyth was no saint. That should be said plainly. But he didn't deserve this. No one does. Clara looked startled. "You knew him well?" "Well enough," the Major replied shortly. "Better than some, perhaps. He was a competent doctor, though too stubborn for his own good, and he had private troubles. I dare say we all do." Before Clara could inquire further, Inspector Graves stepped out onto the veranda. "Miss Marple," he called, "a word, if you please." She walked toward him, pausing only to give Clara's arm a light squeeze of reassurance. Inside the morning room once more, Graves motioned for her to sit. He closed the door behind them, his expression unusually thoughtful. "Forgive the directness, Miss Marple," he began, "but I know of your reputation. Not officially, of course, but word travels. You've assisted in certain inquiries elsewhere, have you not?" "Oh, I wouldn't say assisted, Inspector," Miss Marple demurred. "I may have happened to be present at times when truth came to light. One sees things, you know, especially if one has spent a great many years observing human nature." Graves gave a dry huff of amusement. "Quite. Well, I'm not asking you to do my job, but I'm asking whether anything struck you as unusual this morning. Anything at all." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Unusual things happen constantly in villages, Inspector. Most people simply don't notice them. But if you mean today, yes, there were certain small matters." Graves leaned forward. "Such as?" She looked down at her gloved fingers, stroking one thumb over the other. a gesture that conveyed humility, not hesitation. "For instance, the orchard gate," she said softly. "It was open when we found the body. I've visited Mrs. Faversham before on several summer mornings, and I've never seen that gate open so early." Graves' brows rose. "You believe someone used it?" "I believe it is unwise to overlook small consistencies. Gates do not open themselves, Inspector." He nodded slowly. "Anything else?" Miss Marple hesitated just long enough for the silence to become meaningful. Mrs. Faversham was unsettled before the scream was heard. "You may have noticed her glancing toward the same gate." Graves' eyes sharpened. "You think she expected someone?" "I could not say, but I know the look of a woman bracing herself for something unpleasant." The inspector sat back, considering. "Mrs. Faversham claims she had no idea Dr. Forsyth was already on the grounds." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "She does claim that." Before Graves could probe further, a knock sounded at the door, and the young constable entered. "Inspector, there's someone at the front gate insisting on speaking with you, says it's urgent." Graves stood. "Who is it?" "Reverend Partridge, sir, and he seems distressed." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. "Reverend Partridge rarely appears distressed. Something must be quite wrong." The inspector nodded briskly. "Very well. Show him in." Moments later, the vicar entered, his clerical collar askew and a sheen of sweat on his brow. He looked around nervously before fixing his gaze on Graves. "I'm terribly sorry to intrude," he said, "but I've just come from the church vestry. There was an envelope pushed under the door, addressed to Dr. Forsyth." Graves frowned. "To Dr. Forsyth? After his death?" "I don't know when it was left," the vicar admitted. "But I opened it, Inspector, the circumstances being what they are." Miss Marple watched him calmly, noting the trembling in his fingers, the way he clutched the envelope as if fearing it might burn him. Graves held out his hand. "May I see it?" The vicar passed it over. The inspector slid out a single sheet of paper. His eyes scanned the writing, then widened. "Well?" Miss Marple asked softly. Graves exhaled through his teeth. "It says, 'Meet me at dawn by the orchard wall. There are matters you have kept hidden too long.' And it's signed with only an initial, the letter R." The room fell silent. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window, toward the orchard where the dew had dried and an impression in the grass had begun to fade. A secret meeting, a confrontation planned, and someone who had no intention of letting the doctor leave alive. She spoke gently, almost to herself. Then someone expected Dr. Forsyth at dawn, and someone feared what he might reveal. Inspector Graves read the note again, this time more slowly, as though the meaning might shift under scrutiny. The vicar stood stiffly, wringing his hat between his palms. Miss Marple remained very quiet, her eyes lowered yet unmistakably alert. "At dawn," Graves murmured. "So the meeting was planned, and the orchard wall, exactly where the body was found." Reverend Partridge nodded miserably. "I felt it my duty to bring it at once, though I cannot imagine what the doctor might have been keeping hidden. He was generally regarded as respectable." "Generally is a useful word," Miss Marple said with mild sympathy. "It allows for exceptions." The vicar opened his mouth, perhaps to protest, but Graves cut in. "Thank you for bringing this, Reverend. We may need to speak again later. For now, please keep the matter entirely confidential." "Of course, Inspector." The vicar nodded, though his eyes retained a troubled glimmer, and he excused himself, retreating toward the path. As soon as he had gone, Graves turned to Miss Marple. "This complicates matters." "On the contrary," she said. "It clarifies them, at least a little." "Clarifies? How so?" "A meeting arranged," she said softly, "suggests two parties expecting to speak, but only one arrived alive. Whoever wrote that note must have feared the doctor would reveal something. And fear, Inspector, is very often the seed from which rash actions grow. Graves rubbed his chin. This initial R. It's impossible to know who that might be. A first name, a surname, could be anyone. And yet not too many in Little Brackley, she replied. Villages seldom provide a vast alphabet for one to sort through. Before Graves could respond, they heard raised voices from outside. Clara's strained exclamation floated in through the open window, followed quickly by Major Ashbury's sharply barked command. Graves strode to the doorway at once, Miss Marple following with careful steps. On the veranda, Clara stood rigid, her face chalk white. Across from her, Edwin spoke in a tone that was too controlled to be natural, low, tight, threaded with something that might have been anger or fear. Between them, the constable hovered awkwardly, uncertain whether to intervene. "I'm telling you," Clara insisted, her voice trembling. "I saw him yesterday near the schoolyard. He was arguing with Dr. Forsyth then. Why should it be so impossible to believe there was more to it?" "You're being hysterical," Edwin snapped. "You misunderstand what you saw. The doctor was in excellent spirits yesterday, and even if he had words with someone, it means nothing. Everyone quarrels now and then." "Yes," Clara whispered, "but not like that." Inspector Graves stepped onto the veranda. "What seems to be the problem here?" Edwin's expression shifted into composed courtesy. "A misunderstanding, Inspector. Miss Prowse is overwrought." Clara drew herself upright. "I am not overwrought. I merely remembered something that might matter." Graves regarded her with a steady gaze. "Go on, Miss Prowse." Clara swallowed. "Yesterday afternoon I saw Dr. Forsyth near the school garden. He was speaking with someone quite heatedly. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see his gestures and his expression. It was nothing like the calm man we usually knew." "Who was he speaking with?" Clara hesitated, glancing quickly at Edwin, who stiffened. "I don't know," she admitted. "I only saw the back of the other person. A man, but the coat, dark brown tweed, and the height—" Her gaze flicked again toward Edwin, then away in discomfort. "I only thought, well, perhaps it was someone who might have wished him harm." Edwin's cheeks flushed. "This is ridiculous. I wasn't even near the school yesterday." "Were you not?" Clara asked very gently, yet her words held a tremor that suggested she wanted desperately for him to say something convincing. Inspector Graves studied Edwin. "Perhaps you could clarify your whereabouts yesterday afternoon." "I was in the village," Edwin said, "running errands for my stepmother. Several people saw me." "That's not a time-stamped accounting," Graves replied. "We'll need particulars." Edwin opened his mouth to argue, but Miss Marple spoke first, her tone mild enough to disarm. "It is quite understandable that memories may be uncertain," she said, "especially on a day like today. And I'm sure Edwin will recall the details more clearly once he has had time to sit quietly and think." Clara looked at her sharply, hoping for something in Miss Marple's expression, but Miss Marple offered only a pleasant, grandmotherly smile. Graves dismissed the constable to take notes on Clara's statement, and Edwin, bristling with barely suppressed irritation, excused himself. He walked toward the house with brisk, clipped steps that betrayed more agitation than he intended. When he was gone, Clara exhaled shakily. "I shouldn't have said anything. It sounded like an accusation." "I didn't mean it as one, Miss Marple. I promise." "My dear," Miss Marple said, laying a comforting hand on her arm. "Truths, when spoken gently, rarely do harm. It is the truths left unsaid that tend to cause the most trouble." Clara nodded, though worry lingered in her eyes. "Still, I wish I knew what I saw. Or whom." Miss Marple squeezed her arm lightly. "We shall know in time." Inspector Graves cleared his throat. "Miss Marple? Might I have another moment?" Clara drifted back toward the veranda railing, and Graves lowered his voice as he addressed Miss Marple. "There is something odd about Mr. Faversham," he muttered. "He presents himself well. Too well. the sort of man who's accustomed to managing appearances. Now we learn he may have met with the doctor yesterday, and this morning he's very controlled. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. Too controlled. And Mrs. Faversham, she's not saying all she knows. That much is clear. Miss Marple agreed silently. Judith's earlier glances toward the gate had not been merely anxious. They had been anticipatory, almost resigned. And then there's this letter, Graves continued, tapping his pocket. Someone arranged a meeting with the doctor just before dawn. Someone with reason to hide their name. Someone with an initial R. It could belong to half the county. But I wonder whether the key lies not in the letter itself, but in who knew Dr. Forsyth well enough to threaten him. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Threats take many forms, Inspector. Sometimes they are not meant as threats at all. Sometimes they are pleas. Sometimes warnings. You think the letter writer may not be the murderer? I think nothing for certain yet, she answered. But often in such matters, the person who arranges a meeting is not the same person who fears what might be said there. Graves frowned. You're suggesting a third party. I merely suggest, Miss Marple said, that human affairs rarely fall into neat rows. One must look at them rather like knitting. Knots form where one least expects them. Before the inspector could question her further, a distant sound carried across the lawn, a rapid clatter of hooves on the lane, followed by a voice calling urgently for Mrs. Faversham. Miss Marple turned toward the sound, her expression tightening ever so slightly. Something new had arrived, something that would shift the morning's uneasy balance and lead them closer, if only a step, to the heart of the matter. The call for Mrs. Faversham came from the front gate, urgent enough to send Judith hurrying through the hall with a startled, fluttering motion that did not suit her usual composure. Inspector Graves followed at once. Miss Marple, though slower, kept a measured pace, her eyes attentive to every shift in the atmosphere around them. Outside, a stable lad from the village inn stood beside a sweating bay horse, cap in hand and chest heaving. He bowed his head respectfully when Mrs. Faversham appeared, but his distress was clear enough without words. "Beg pardon, ma'am," he said, "but Mrs. Dalrymple sent me. She had a message come in for you. Said it was urgent, from Dr. Forsyth's sister." Judith stiffened. His sister? "Yes, ma'am. She's been staying at Mrs. Dalrymple's this week. The message says she needs to see you at once. She's in a bad way." Inspector Graves stepped closer. "Did the message say why?" "No, sir. Only that she must speak with Mrs. Faversham straight away about something very important. She looked fair shaken, Mrs. Dalrymple said." Judith pressed her hand to her mouth. A tremor passed visibly through her shoulders. I hadn't realized Lionel's sister was in the village. She didn't come to the breakfast. I assumed she was, well, resting." Miss Marple watched her closely. Judith spoke calmly enough, but something in the way her eyes darted, not to the inspector but to the orchard in the distance, betrayed a deeper disquiet. "I shall go at once," Judith said. "Edwin can accompany me." The stable lad shifted from foot to foot. "Mrs. Dalrymple said she'd best see you alone, ma'am. She was rather insistent." A flush of confusion rose on Judith's cheeks. "Alone?" Inspector Graves intervened. "I think it best that I come with you, Mrs. Faversham. If the message concerns Dr. Forsyth, it may be relevant to the inquiry." Judith hesitated, lips parting as if to object, but she nodded after only a moment. Yes, of course. That seems proper." She allowed Graves to help her into the waiting trap. The stable lad mounted behind to guide the horse. As they departed down the lane, Judith clutched the edge of the seat as though steadying herself against more than a physical jolt. Miss Marple stood on the gravel path, watching the trap disappear. Clara, hovering near the veranda, approached timidly. "What could his sister possibly want with Mrs. Faversham?" Clara whispered. "And why insist on seeing her alone?" Sometimes grief prefers familiar company. Miss Marple replied. Sometimes it prefers the company of those who understand more than they say, and sometimes, her tone softened, it prefers company that shares its secrets. Clara paled. You think, oh my dear, Miss Marple said gently. I think nothing more than that sorrow often reveals truths people try very hard to keep hidden. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, troubled. Everything feels strange today. Everyone seems to be hiding something. In villages, Miss Marple said softly. Everyone is hiding something. Most of those secrets do no harm, but some become quite dangerous when stirred. Across the lawn, Major Ashbury strode toward them, his boots biting crisply into the gravel. Miss Marple, he said sharply, may I have a word, in private? Of course, Major. She offered Clara an encouraging glance before following him a short distance away. When they were safely out of earshot, the Major exhaled heavily, removing his hat. It's this business with Edwin. The inspector seems to believe the boy may have had some quarrel with Forsyth yesterday. I must tell you, Miss Marple, Edwin Faversham is no murderer. He may be impulsive, but he's not violent. Miss Marple regarded him mildly. You speak very strongly in his defense, Major. Because I know him, Ashbury replied. I've known Judith even longer. When she remarried, Edwin was just 13, a nervous lad. She did her best with him, though I dare say Lionel Forsyth did not always approve of how things were managed. Ah, Miss Marple murmured. You imply Dr. Forsyth expressed his disapproval? Often, the Major said bitterly. He was a man who believed his judgment superior on all matters, particularly those involving the Faversham estate. Miss Marple watched the change in the Major's face, the tightness in the jaw, the faint strain at the temples. You seem very certain Forsyth's opinions caused trouble. They did, Ashbury said shortly. Edwin chafed under the man. Judith suffered his criticism quietly. And as for myself, he broke off abruptly, turning his gaze toward the orchard. I'm rambling. The point is, Forsyth had strong views and expressed them freely. That doesn't make him deserving of murder. No, Miss Marple agreed, but strong views can create strong resentments. Ashbury's shoulders tensed. You're suggesting someone close to him struck back. I'm suggesting only that human beings often hurt most deeply, those they are entangled with most closely, Miss Marple replied gently. It is not accusation, Major, merely observation. The Major looked unsettled, though whether by her words or by the shadow of guilt flickering behind them, she could not yet tell. Before either could continue, Hector Billing emerged from the side gate, his face flushed with self-important discovery. Miss Marple, he called. Major, you must hear this at once. Extraordinary news. Miss Marple suppressed a sigh. Yes, Mr. Billing. He approached at a dramatic pace, glancing around to ensure an audience, though none was present save the two of them. I have just come from the antiquities shop, he announced breathlessly. A customer came in, a traveling bookseller who passes through each fortnight. He mentioned he saw Dr. Forsyth shortly after dawn this morning, walking quickly, and not alone. Miss Marple exchanged a quick look with the Major. Not alone? No, Billing said triumphantly. With a woman. She had a dark coat and a veil over her face. Quite mysterious. They were headed toward the Faversham property. The bookseller thought nothing of it at the time, but when he heard about the murder, Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her voice remained mild. You are certain he said a woman? Oh, yes, he was adamant. A woman of medium height, he said, moving decisively. Major Ashbury frowned. Dr. Forsyth was not known for early morning strolls with mysterious ladies. No, indeed, Billing exclaimed, which suggests... Well, one hardly likes to imagine what it suggests. Miss Marple regarded him gently. One imagines very easily, Mr. Billing, but imagination can be quite misleading if it gallops too freely. Still, Miss Marple felt the significance of the report settling like the weight of a pebble dropped into still water. A secret dawn meeting. A letter signed only R. And now, someone, some woman, walking with the doctor toward the orchard just before his death. Clara Prowse returned to them at that moment, her face touched with fresh concern. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "Edwin has gone to the stables. He looked rather wild. I fear he may do something foolish." "Foolish people," Miss Marple replied gently, "rarely think they are acting so." As she spoke, a faint rumble sounded in the distance. Not thunder, but carriage wheels returning along the lane. Clara turned. "It's Mrs. Faversham," she whispered. The trap came into view, slower than it had departed. Judith sat rigid beside Inspector Graves, her gloved hands motionless in her lap. The stable lad kept his gaze respectfully forward, but even from a distance, one could see something heavy had transpired. When the trap stopped, Graves dismounted first. His expression was graver than before. Mrs. Faversham remained seated for a long moment, as though rising required a will she no longer possessed. At last, she stepped down. Her face was drained of color, but her eyes, not tearful, not wavering, held a clarity that had not been there earlier. Miss Marple moved toward her with quiet compassion. "I hope the meeting was not too distressing, my dear." Judith swallowed hard. It was enlightening and terrible. "What did Dr. Forsyth's sister wish to tell you?" Graves asked gently. Judith's trembling breath shivered in the air between them. "She said," Judith whispered, "that Lionel received another letter yesterday, different from the one Reverend Partridge found. A letter threatening to expose something from his past, something he believed might ruin more than his own reputation." She paused, her voice cracking. "And she said," Judith continued, "that the person behind that threat was someone he trusted, someone he thought incapable of betrayal." Miss Marple's eyes lowered. A secret meeting at dawn. A betrayal discovered before death. A killer driven not by impulse, but by fear of what would come to light. And still, the web around Dr. Forsyth remained only partly untangled. Mrs. Faversham's final words seemed to settle over the garden like an unexpected frost, tightening the air, halting speech. Inspector Graves regarded her with a depth of attention he had not shown earlier. Miss Marple, watching quietly, noted that Judith did not shrink under his scrutiny. If anything, she looked as though she had finally surrendered to a truth too heavy to carry alone. "Mrs. Faversham," Graves said gently, "did Dr. Forsyth's sister say what this past matter concerned?" Judith closed her eyes for a moment, gathering herself. "She said Lionel had been troubled for months, that someone had been writing to him, someone who knew something about a mistake he made years ago. A medical matter." "A misdiagnosis?" Graves asked. Judith shook her head. "No, something worse. But she didn't know the details. Lionel had been very careful to conceal it, even from her." Miss Marple could see the strain tightening Judith's throat as she spoke, as if each admission pressed upon an old wound. When Judith opened her eyes again, they looked faintly bruised by fear. He told her only that the truth, if revealed, would cause terrible pain to someone he cared for deeply, she whispered. "Someone still living in the village." Miss Marple's gaze flicked gently toward the orchard, then back to Judith's pale face. "Did she say whether he intended to confess this truth, or to keep it hidden?" Judith hesitated. She said he meant to put the matter right. At last. He had arranged a meeting. She did not know with whom, but he was going to reveal the secret today. Inspector Graves exchanged a meaningful glance with Miss Marple. "Then the person he arranged to meet," he said slowly, "may be the same person who sent the letter found at the church, or someone else entirely, someone who feared that revelation." Judith clutched her shawl as though bracing against a sudden chill. Lionel never intended harm to anyone, but secrets can hurt even when held in silence. Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes, my dear." "They often do." Before Judith could say more, Edwin appeared at the doorway of the house, face stiff, hair slightly disheveled. Whatever he had gone to the stables to do or say had left him shaken. His eyes darted from his stepmother to Graves, then to Miss Marple, as though trying to determine how much had been learned in his absence. "Mother," he said sharply, "you shouldn't be out here. You're exhausted. Come inside." Judith allowed him to take her arm, but her gaze lingered briefly on Miss Marple, full of a silent plea. There was something Judith wanted to say, something she dared not voice before Edwin. Miss Marple gave the faintest of nods, a promise that she understood. Inspector Graves waited until they had gone before exhaling slowly. "This matter is widening rapidly. A medical error, a long-held secret, blackmail, and now, if Mr. Billings' information is accurate, a woman seen walking with Forsyth at dawn." Miss Marple moved to the veranda railing, her hand resting lightly on the polished wood. "Secrets involving deep personal pain," she said thoughtfully, "are rarely shared widely. If Dr. Forsyth feared exposing someone he cared about, we might consider whom he held in close regard." Graves hummed low in his throat. He was unmarried. No known romantic entanglements. "None public," Miss Marple corrected gently. "But affection takes many forms. Compassion, mentorship, guilt, even quiet devotion, and of course, resentment can grow strongest between those bound by such delicate ties." The inspector's eyes narrowed. "You suspect someone among the guests, someone close enough to be implicated in the terrible pain you mentioned?" "That is only where logic points," she replied. "Not yet to a name, but to proximity." Graves folded his arms, considering. "We'll need statements from the entire village at this rate." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, people will talk without being asked. They always do when frightened. Listen closely enough, and they may say more than they intend." As if summoned by the truth of her words, the sound of hurried footsteps sounded from the lane. Lydia Harper, the Faversham's maid, came running across the lawn, her apron flapping, her face blotched with worry. "Miss Marple! Inspector!" she cried. "Please, come quickly. It's Mrs. Prowse." Clara's name struck both listeners sharply. Graves stepped forward at once. "What has happened?" Lydia struggled to catch her breath. "Miss Clara, she fainted in the schoolyard. They've taken her to the infirmary room at the church. Reverend Partridge sent me. He said the inspector should come at once." Miss Marple exchanged a swift glance with Graves. Clara had been visibly distressed earlier, her nerves frayed nearly to breaking, but fainting was not typical of her. Something had happened, something more than shock. "I'll go," Graves said. "Miss Marple, perhaps you should remain here." Miss Marple gave a soft hum of disapproval. "I think, Inspector, that it would be wise for me to accompany you. Clara Prowse is a sensitive young woman, but she is not prone to collapse without cause. And I have often found that fainting spells in villages are very seldom merely fainting spells." Lydia twisted her hands anxiously. She kept saying something before she fainted. "What was it?" Miss Marple asked with calm urgency. That she had remembered something else about yesterday. Something important. Something about Dr. Forsyth. Graves stiffened. "Did she say what?" "No, sir. Only that she had been mistaken, that it wasn't just a quarrel she saw." Lydia swallowed. She said she'd suddenly realized who the other person must have been. Miss Marple's expression softened with grim understanding. "Oh dear," she murmured. "Realization, Inspector, can be quite as dangerous as revelation, especially if someone fears being discovered." Graves moved decisively toward the gate. No time to waste. As they hurried down the lane, Miss Marple kept pace surprisingly well, her delicate steps untroubled by haste. Her eyes were steady, thoughtful, the blue of them sharp with quiet comprehension. Someone had met Dr. Forsyth at dawn. Someone had feared what he intended to confess. Someone had been recognized, belatedly, by Clara Prowse. And someone, fearing exposure, had acted quickly. The faint ring of church bells drifted faintly through the summer air, the hour marking itself as the investigation crept closer to a truth someone desperately wanted buried. The path to the church wound between hedgerows, shimmering in the early afternoon heat, but neither Inspector Graves nor Miss Marple felt the warmth. Lydia hurried ahead, glancing back repeatedly to ensure they followed, her breath coming in anxious bursts. The faint toll of the bells had ceased, leaving behind an uncanny stillness, one that seemed to deepen as they approached the stone building. Inside, the vestry door stood open, and Reverend Partridge motioned urgently. His normally serene countenance was drawn and pale. "She's lying in the infirmary room," he whispered. "She came round once, only briefly, and then she asked to see Miss Marple." Graves raised an eyebrow, but Miss Marple simply nodded. "Let us go in." The infirmary room was a small chamber near the back of the church, furnished with a narrow cot and a wash-stand. Clara Prowse lay on the cot, her skin waxen, her dark hair damp against her forehead. Her breathing was shallow, and she blinked weakly at the ceiling as they entered. Miss Marple moved to her side with soft, measured steps. She took the girl's hand gently. "My dear, you've given us all quite a fright." Clara's eyes shifted toward her, focusing slowly. "Miss Marple, I didn't mean to faint. I just felt dizzy." Inspector Graves approached the foot of the cot. "Miss Prowse, can you tell us what happened? Reverend Partridge said you remembered something important." Clara swallowed with difficulty. "Yes, I did. I remembered something from yesterday afternoon. Something I should have realized sooner." Miss Marple brushed a stray lock of hair from Clara's temple. "There is no hurry, dear. Tell us at your own pace." Clara nodded faintly. "I saw the quarrel yesterday. Dr. Forsyth and the other person. I thought it was a man. The coat was masculine, the stance, the broad shoulders." Her brow furrowed as if reliving the moment. "But just before I fainted, I remembered something else. A movement, so distinctive." Graves leaned forward. "What movement?" Clara closed her eyes, summoning strength. When the argument ended, the other person raised a hand to their throat. A quick, nervous gesture. They always do that when flustered. Miss Marple's grip on Clara's hand tightened ever so slightly. "Always? Meaning someone you know?" "Yes," Clara whispered. I believe it was Mrs. Faversham." A hush filled the room as though even the walls recoiled. Inspector Graves straightened sharply. "Mrs. Faversham, are you certain?" Clara's eyes opened halfway. It must have been. She wears those tailored coats that could look like a man's from behind. And that gesture, I've noticed it countless times during school fund meetings. When she's upset, she touches her throat as though her collar is too tight. She shivered. But I didn't think of it until just now. Graves paced a short step, troubled. "Mrs. Faversham claimed she had no knowledge of Dr. Forsyth being on the grounds this morning. She claimed she hadn't spoken to him recently." Clara shook her head weakly. "She's lying, Inspector. I saw them together. Yesterday." Miss Marple exhaled, a soft, sorrowful sound. "And this morning, Dr. Forsyth meant to reveal something painful, something concerning someone he cared for." Graves's jaw hardened. If Mrs. Faversham had something to hide— Clara grasped Miss Marple's hand more tightly. "I don't want to accuse her. I only want the truth." "You have done your duty, my dear," Miss Marple soothed. "And now you must rest." The Reverend hovered anxiously as Graves and Miss Marple stepped away from the cot. Graves spoke in a low, urgent tone. "If Clara is correct, then Mrs. Faversham misled us deliberately. That puts her at the center of this. She had motive, opportunity, and a connection to the doctor's secret. "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, "but it would be wise not to leap too quickly. Clara's realization is important, but it is not yet proof." Graves frowned. "You sound unconvinced." "Oh, not unconvinced," she corrected gently. "Merely careful. Appearances can be deceptive, and motives often twist themselves into shapes we least expect." Before he could respond, the church door creaked open. Major Ashbury entered hurriedly, his expression taut with concern. "Inspector, Miss Marple, I've been looking everywhere for you." He approached, lowering his voice. "There's trouble back at the Faversham house. Edwin is missing." Graves stiffened. "Missing?" "He left the stables half an hour ago," Ashbury said. "He took one of the riding horses and galloped off toward the woods. The stable boy says he looked terribly upset." Miss Marple observed the Major with quiet intensity. "And why, Major? Are you the one bringing this news?" Ashbury hesitated. "Judith asked me to keep an eye on him. She's worried the inspector suspects him, and I fear Edwin may believe the same." Graves muttered a curse under his breath. "If Edwin panicked because he thinks we're closing in?" Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. "Fear sends people running, Inspector, but running from something is very different from running to something." "What do you mean?" Ashbury asked. "I wonder," she said softly, "whom Edwin went to see." Graves rubbed his temples. "This case is unraveling faster than I can tie it together. Mrs. Faversham lying, Edwin running, letters of blackmail, Dr. Forsyth planning a confession." He paused, troubled. "And now Clara identifying Mrs. Faversham as the person arguing with the doctor." "It is a great many threads," Miss Marple agreed calmly. "But threads often converge to one knot." The inspector straightened. "We need to confront Judith at once. If she argued with Forsyth yesterday, and if Forsyth meant to expose something about her today, she may well be our prime suspect." Miss Marple lifted a gentle hand. "Inspector, tread carefully. Judith Faversham is a woman of delicate constitution. A direct accusation might collapse her entirely, and that would solve nothing. Speak with her, yes, but not as though you presume her guilty." Graves hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. But I'll need you present, Miss Marple. You have a way of softening the blows." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Years of church committees, Inspector. One learns to handle delicate matters." They began to leave the church, but just as they reached the doorway, Clara's faint voice drifted after them. "Miss Marple." Miss Marple turned back. Clara's eyes were open, pleading, "Please, be gentle with Mrs. Faversham. I'm frightened I've done something wrong." Miss Marple approached once more, touching the girl's shoulder with comforting warmth. "You have done only what conscience compelled. Whatever truth emerges now, it was already woven before today. Rest, Miss Prowse. You will not face this alone." Clara's eyes closed again. Relieved, as Miss Marple stepped outside into the warm air, Graves at her side. She felt the subtle shift of the village around them, the quiet stirrings of hidden truths wrestling their way toward daylight. Judith Faversham had reason to fear something in Dr. Forsyth's past. Edwin had fled with the look of a young man cornered, and someone still unnamed, had walked with the doctor at dawn. But Miss Marple knew that the heart of a mystery rarely lay in the loudest fear. It lay in the quietest lie, and little Brackley was full of quiet lies waiting to be heard. The walk back to the Faversham house felt heavier than the one that had taken them to the church. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lane, stretching the hedgerows into dark, wavering fingers that seemed to follow them. Inspector Graves walked with purposeful strides, but Miss Marple moved more reflectively, her parasol tapping lightly against the ground. She could almost sense the village holding its breath, windows closed, curtains drawn just enough to permit a sliver of observation. Fear, she thought, always made people watchful. As they approached the house, they found Judith seated on a bench beneath the veranda, her hands folded motionlessly in her lap. She looked as if she had aged 10 years in as many hours. Major Ashbury hovered nearby, stiff with the awkward concern of a man unused to comforting anyone. Judith looked up as Graves approached, her expression a mixture of dread and resignation. "Inspector, did you find Clara? Is she all right?" "She is resting," Graves replied. "She fainted, but she is stable." Miss Marple saw to her. Judith's eyes flicked gratefully to the older woman. "I'm glad. She's a sensitive girl." Miss Marple took a seat beside Judith, her presence gentle as falling ash. "Clara remembered something important," she said quietly. "It concerns the quarrel she witnessed yesterday." Judith's breath caught. Her fingers curled inward with a faint tremor. "Oh, did she?" "Yes," Miss Marple continued, "and she now believes that the person arguing with Dr. Forsyth was not a man at all, but a woman whose posture and coat created a misleading impression from behind." Judith stared down at her lap. "I see." Inspector Graves stepped forward. "Mrs. Faversham, Clara believes that woman was you." The words settled into the still air like a stone dropped into a silent pond. The Major inhaled sharply, but Judith did not flinch. Instead, she closed her eyes briefly, as though the truth, now spoken aloud, was almost a relief. "Yes," she whispered, "it was me." Graves stiffened. "You admit it?" "Yes. I argued with Lionel yesterday." Judith lifted her head, and though her face was pale, her expression held a newfound steadiness. "I suppose I should have told you sooner, but I was frightened, not of what I had done, but of how it might appear." "Then tell us now," Graves urged. "All of it." Judith took a thin, wavering breath. "Lionel sought me out yesterday afternoon. He said he needed to speak with me privately about something from many years ago. Something I believed long forgotten." Her hands tightened together. "It concerned Edwin." Miss Marple did not move, but she felt the faintest tightening in her chest. She had suspected as much. "Edwin," Graves echoed. "Explain." "When Edwin was a boy," Judith said slowly, "before he lost his father, he fell gravely ill. Lionel treated him. He treated him for months." She swallowed. "But years later, I learned from Lionel's sister that he had made an error. A misdiagnosis. Edwin's suffering had been prolonged because Lionel had insisted upon a treatment that was unnecessary, even harmful." The Major exhaled, stunned. "Good heavens." Judith shut her eyes again. Lionel never forgave himself. He had hoped his error would remain hidden, buried in old papers and forgotten days. And I thought it was over. Edwin recovered. He grew strong, but Lionel said the matter was haunting him again. Someone had discovered the truth and threatened to expose him. He believed I might be dragged into the scandal as well. "And your argument?" Graves pressed. "He wanted my forgiveness." Judith shook her head. "But he already had it. What angered me was his refusal to name the blackmailer. He said it was someone close to us, someone who knew Edwin's history." Her voice grew strained. "Someone he once trusted." Miss Marple watched her with sympathy. "Did he tell you anything else?" "No," Judith whispered. "He said he needed time to decide what to do. And this morning, he meant to meet with the blackmailer." She raised her eyes to Graves, full of anguish. "But I did not kill him. I swear it. I argued with him, but I would never." Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on her arm. "No one is accusing you of murder, my dear. But we must understand what happened." Graves cleared his throat, though his expression softened. "Mrs. Faversham, your admission is important, but it does not prove guilt. It does, however, alter the timeline. You told us earlier you had no idea Lionel was on the property this morning." Judith hesitated. shame creeping over her features. I suspected he might be. He said he intended to settle things today, but I had no idea he would come so early, and I certainly didn't know he'd gone to the orchard. Another silence followed. Major Ashbury stepped forward abruptly. "Inspector, Judith is telling the truth. I've known her for years. She would not harm anyone." Graves gave a stiff nod. "We shall take her statement formally, but for now, Mrs. Faversham, you are not under arrest. I ask only that you remain here until the matter is resolved." Judith gave a weary nod. At that moment, the sound of hurried footsteps approached from the lane. Hector Billing appeared, panting dramatically and waving a folded slip of paper. "Inspector, Miss Marple, something's been left at the shop. A message slipped under the door. I believe it concerns the murder." Graves strode toward him. "What message?" Billing handed it over with great flourish. "Found it not 10 minutes ago. Quite alarming, I assure you." Graves unfolded the paper, his brow furrowed. Miss Marple leaned close enough to see the brief scrawl. "You seek the wrong one. Look to the woods before it is too late." It was unsigned, but beneath the hastily written words was a faint smear of mud. Mud dark enough, thick enough, to resemble the damp earth of the northern woods near Little Brackley. Graves looked up sharply. Edwin rode toward the woods. Miss Marple closed her parasol with a soft click. "Yes, Inspector, and I believe someone fears what he may find there. Or whom?" Graves set his jaw. "We go at once." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes darkening with quiet certainty. The woods held answers, or dangers, possibly both. Inspector Graves wasted no time. He called for the constable, issued terse instructions, and within minutes they were making their way toward the northern edge of Little Brackley. Miss Marple accompanied them without question. Though the journey was brisk, she moved with determination, her parasol tucked neatly beneath her arm, her gaze thoughtful rather than anxious. The woods lay ahead, dense, shadowed, and seldom visited, and Miss Marple sensed, with an intuition sharpened by many years, that whatever they found there would alter the course of the investigation. The path grew narrower as they approached the tree line. Sunlight flickered through the branches in fitful patches, casting mottled shapes upon the ground. Graves paused, scanning the dirt road leading into the forest. "There," he said, pointing to the fresh hoof prints in the soft earth. "One horse. Moving fast." Miss Marple studied the prints with narrowed eyes. Edwin was in a hurry. "Running to escape," the constable muttered. Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "Possibly. But a young man fleeing guilt often seeks safety in familiar places. These woods, they are not familiar. Something or someone drew him here." They continued deeper, following the winding trail. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp leaves and moss. Somewhere overhead, a wood pigeon cooed mournfully. Then, abruptly, the constable raised a hand. "Listen," he whispered. Faintly, from farther within the trees, came the muffled sound of a horse snorting, followed by the echo of a voice, breathless, urgent, and distinctly human. "That's Edwin," Graves said. "He's close." They quickened their pace. The path curved sharply, and then they saw him. Edwin Faversham stood beside his horse in a small clearing, his coat askew, one glove missing, his hair wind-tossed. He had clearly been pacing. The earth bore the marks of repeated steps. At the sound of their approach, he spun around, his expression a mixture of anger and fear. "You shouldn't be here," he cried. "Inspector, Miss Marple, you must leave at once." Graves stepped into the clearing, hands raised in a calm but authoritative gesture. "Mr. Faversham, you've caused enough alarm already. What are you doing out here?" "I came," Edwin faltered, swallowing hard. "I came because I received a message." Miss Marple felt a familiar flutter of recognition. "Another note, Mr. Faversham?" Edwin hesitated, then nodded. Yes, at the stables. Someone left it on the mounting block. It said to come alone to the woods, that I would find the truth here. Truth about my past. Inspector Graves' eyes narrowed. Your past, or Dr. Forsyth's? Edwin closed his eyes briefly. Does it matter? They are bound together, always have been. Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice soft. Edwin, did you believe the note came from Dr. Forsyth? A tremor passed through him. I didn't know, but I couldn't ignore it. Not after everything I've heard today. Lionel's sister speaking with my stepmother, the argument Clara remembered. And now the inspector questioning me as though I... He broke off abruptly. No one has accused you of murder, Graves said firmly. Not yet. Edwin's face twisted. But you suspect it. I saw it in your eyes. Miss Marple gave a gentle sigh. My dear boy, suspicion is not conclusion. It is merely one path among many, and yours is far from the clearest. Before Edwin could respond, a sudden crack of branches echoed behind them. Inspector Graves spun around, signaling the constable to move to his right. Show yourself, Graves commanded. Come out. For a breathing pause, only the rustle of leaves answered. Then a figure emerged slowly from behind a large oak. Reverend Partridge. His clerical collar was askew, his coat dusty as though he'd stumbled through brush, and his expression one of deep distress. Inspector, Miss Marple. Edwin. His breath came unevenly. Thank heavens I found you. Graves eyed him sharply. Reverend, what in blazes are you doing here? Partridge raised both hands in a gesture of helplessness. I received a note as well. Pushed through my vestry door, it said I must come to the woods. That someone was in danger. Miss Marple exchanged a look with Graves. Another note, another lure, another thread in the same web. She studied Partridge carefully. There was sweat upon his brow, but his trembling seemed genuine. His boots were muddied, but so would anyone's be after coming through the undergrowth. His eyes, however, those told the deeper story. They were filled not with fear, but with grief. A grief Miss Marple had noticed earlier when he spoke of Dr. Forsyth. Reverend, she said gently, how well did you know Dr. Forsyth? Partridge blinked rapidly. We were friends, of a sort. He confided in me at times. In recent months he had been troubled. I prayed with him, but he would not reveal the burden. Did he ever speak of the past mistake he made? She asked quietly. Partridge's face tightened. He hinted at it, yes. Said he feared the truth would destroy someone he loved. But he would not say more. Edwin flinched visibly. Inspector Graves stepped forward, voice low and firm. Reverend, if you know anything at all, about who might have blackmailed Dr. Forsyth, you must tell us. Partridge shook his head vehemently. I swear, Inspector, I know nothing of that. I only know he was desperate to protect someone. Miss Marple looked between the two men, the Reverend wringing his hands, Edwin standing rigid with dread. She felt certain now that the heart of the matter lay not merely in Forsyth's past mistake, but in whom that mistake touched most deeply. An uneasy wind slipped through the clearing, brushing the branches in a low whisper. Then the constable, who had begun to circle the perimeter, called out sharply, "Inspector, over here!" They hurried to where he stood. On the ground, half hidden beneath a tangle of ferns, lay a torn scrap of fabric. Graves crouched to retrieve it. Dark brown tweed, the color of the coat Clara had described. The color Edwin was known to wear, but this cloth was frayed, old, weathered, too old to be part of Edwin's new riding jacket. Miss Marple recognized it instantly. That, she said softly, is from Dr. Forsyth's overcoat, the one he wore last winter. Edwin inhaled sharply. Why would it be here? Miss Marple touched the fabric lightly. Because someone wanted you to find it. Inspector Graves rose slowly. "Someone is leading you, Edwin. Someone wants you to be frightened, to run, to seem guilty." Edwin's eyes widened. "Then who—" A sudden crack sounded deeper in the forest, loud, sharp, unmistakable. A gunshot. The birds scattered in a flurry of wings. The horse reared violently, and Edwin cried out, struggling to calm it. Graves drew his revolver. "Stay where you are," he barked. "Constable, with me, Miss Marple." But Miss Marple, though she stayed put, had already fixed her gaze in the direction of the shot. Her voice was calm, yet edged with urgency. "That, Inspector, was not a warning. Someone has acted in desperation." Edwin was pale as chalk. "Who was shot?" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind aligning the pieces with swift and terrible clarity. "Not who," she murmured. "But why?" And suddenly she knew. The killer had not come to the woods to flee. The killer had come to silence someone before the truth reached them. Inspector Graves did not waste a single breath. He snapped an order to the constable and plunged deeper into the woods, branches whipping against his coat. Reverend Partridge froze in terror, while Edwin remained rooted, half holding his trembling horse, his lips forming silent questions he could not voice. Miss Marple stood very still, her eyes narrowed in the direction of the shot, her expression not of fear but of grim realization. "Miss Marple," Edwin gasped, Who do you think—" "Hush, dear boy," she said softly. "Let us not leap where the truth has not yet landed." But Edwin could not hush. His breath came in shallow bursts. "If someone has been shot, if someone followed me, then they meant to reach someone else before you did," Miss Marple murmured. "And that is a very different thing." Before Edwin could respond, the inspector's voice rang out distantly through the trees. "Over here." Edwin tied his horse hastily and sprinted toward the call. Miss Marple moved after him, slow enough not to endanger her footing, fast enough not to lose sight of the developing truth. Reverend Partridge followed in stumbling steps, wiping sweat from his brow. The underbrush grew denser as they reached a thicket where sunlight struggled to penetrate. The constable stood ahead, one hand raised in the universal signal for caution. Graves knelt beside something half concealed by brambles. As Miss Marple approached, her heart tightened. A man lay on the ground, curled on his side. His clothes were dusty, his clerical jacket torn, but the wound, fresh, sharp, and bleeding at the shoulder, was unmistakable. It was not a new victim. It was the vicar. Reverend Partridge cried out behind them, staggering backward at the sight of himself mirrored on the ground, until Miss Marple turned sharply. "Oh no, Reverend," she said gently. "This is not you." The figure on the ground stirred, groaning. As Inspector Graves turned the man slightly, the face came into view, pale with pain, but unmistakable. It was Ralph Partridge, the Reverend's younger brother, long rumored to have left Little Brackley under difficult circumstances years before. Few spoke of him, and even fewer remembered him well. The real Partridge, Reverend Samuel Partridge, stood trembling. "Ralph? Ralph, what in heaven's name?" But Ralph pushed weakly to sit, wincing as blood seeped between his fingers. "Sam, I told you to stay away." Miss Marple lowered herself carefully to a crouch beside him. "You were the one who wrote to Dr. Forsyth. The initial R. It was you, was it not?" Ralph's eyes fluttered open, full of pain and despair. "I only wanted to warn him. I never meant harm. Never." Inspector Graves pressed a cloth to the wound. "Who shot you?" Ralph swallowed. His voice trembled. I came to meet Edwin. I left that note because I knew someone would try to mislead him. I needed to tell him the truth." His gaze shifted toward Edwin, who stood white-faced, shaken. "I thought, you deserve to know." "Know what?" Edwin's voice cracked. Ralph coughed, grimacing. "About the blackmail. It wasn't me. I only discovered someone had been using my name. Someone who found my old letters in the church archives. Someone who knew Forsyth's secret. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Someone with access to the vestry. Someone familiar with the archives. Someone Reverend Partridge trusted. The constable's eyes widened. You mean... Miss Marple did not answer him. She already knew. She could feel the circle tightening, the threads finally pulling taut. Ralph lifted his good hand, pointing weakly toward a break in the trees. She ran that way, just before you arrived. She, Edwin whispered. Who is she? Ralph's breathing became ragged. He told me everything. Lionel Forsyth. He carried that guilt for years. The wrong treatment, the months of pain you endured. He never forgave himself. But it wasn't only that. There was something else. Someone else who suffered because of him. Miss Marple nodded. A mother who blamed him. A widow who lost more than a husband. Grief and bitterness. Such things ferment silently over years. Edwin stared, uncomprehending. I don't understand. Miss Marple straightened slowly. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of truth long deferred. Your mother, Edwin, your birth mother. A stunned silence fell. Edwin blinked several times, unable to process the words. What about her? Inspector Graves looked at Miss Marple sharply. Go on. Miss Marple folded her hands together. Your mother died shortly after you recovered, did she not? A sudden collapse. Many assumed it was grief, exhaustion. But in small villages, the truth often lies in what is not spoken. Ralph nodded weakly. She blamed Forsyth. Said he nearly killed you, said he stole what little life she had left. And when she died, Forsyth believed, rightly or wrongly, that his error had hastened it. Miss Marple's eyes softened. She left behind a sister, a woman who adored her, who swore to protect her memory. Edwin's breath caught. His eyes widened with dawning horror. My aunt, he whispered, Mrs. Dalrymple. Inspector Graves cursed under his breath. She's the one who sent for Mrs. Faversham this morning. She's the one who pressed the sister to speak. And she is the only person, Miss Marple added softly, who knew both the past tragedy and the present secrets. She had access to the vestry. She could forge Ralph's initial. She could lure the doctor to the orchard, and Ralph here, and she was determined to avenge her sister. Edwin staggered, gripping a tree branch for support. But she was always so kind. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Kindness and vengeance, dear boy, can reside in the same heart when grief runs deep. From the distance came the sharp crack of a branch, the hurried rustle of footsteps fleeing farther into the woods. Inspector Graves stood abruptly. She's still here, and armed. Miss Marple nodded. Oh yes, Inspector. And she has acted with growing desperation, but she will not run far. Edwin wiped his face, torn between shock and disbelief. She killed him, Dr. Forsyth, for something that happened so long ago. For love, Edwin, Miss Marple said softly. A twisted love, perhaps, but still love. Graves motioned to the constable. Stay with Ralph. Miss Marple, Edwin, stay behind me. But Miss Marple placed a light hand on his arm. Inspector, let me speak to her first. She will not fire on an old woman, and she has already harmed the person she believed responsible. Graves hesitated, but only briefly. Miss Marple's calm resolve was as steady as any officer's weapon. Very well, he said. But I stay close. Miss Marple nodded, gathering her breath as she stepped toward the shadows between the trees. The truth had now fully surfaced, and the final confrontation waited just beyond the clearing, where vengeance, grief, and guilt converged beneath the dark canopy of Little Brackley Wood. The woods grew quieter as Miss Marple advanced, her steps deliberate, almost meditative, as though she had walked into many such shadows before. Inspector Graves followed at a respectful distance, revolver in hand, but even he sensed that the coming moment would not be settled by force. Ahead, through the ferns and twisted branches, a figure moved, unsteadily but with purpose, struggling through the undergrowth toward the deeper thickets. Miss Marple recognized the dark coat, the familiar profile, the stiff, determined shoulders. "Mrs. Dalrymple," she called gently, as one might call to a frightened child. "My dear, please stop a moment." The woman froze. Her breath came in ragged bursts. Slowly she turned, revealing a face flushed with fear, grief, and the wild intensity of a long-buried wound torn open. "Don't come closer," she warned. Her voice trembled, though the pistol in her hand did not waver. "I don't want to hurt anyone else." Miss Marple raised both hands, palms outward, a gesture of old-fashioned reassurance. "No one wishes to hurt you either, Mrs. Dalrymple. The time for harm is over." "It can't be," the woman whispered, gripping the weapon more tightly. "Not until the truth is known." Miss Marple stepped nearer, her voice low, calm. "The truth is known, at last, but it needn't claim another life." Mrs. Dalrymple's face twisted. "You don't understand. Lionel Forsyth stole my sister's life. He stole her hope and her strength. She was never the same after Edwin's illness, never the same after his mistakes." "And that was tragedy," Miss Marple agreed softly. "But tragedy is not the same as murder. You let grief grow into something darker, something that consumed you." Mrs. Dalrymple shook her head violently. He intended to confess. He was going to tell everyone what he had done. He would have been praised for his honesty, pitied even. "And what of my sister? Who would remember her? Who would speak her name?" No, he had to feel what we felt. He had to lose everything. Inspector Graves stepped closer, but Miss Marple lifted one hand slightly, signaling him to remain back. "You wrote the letters," Miss Marple continued. "One to lure the doctor, one to mislead young Edwin, and one meant to draw Ralph Partridge into danger." Mrs. Dalrymple's eyes flickered with despair. "I needed time. I needed to make it look as though others might be guilty. But Ralph found out. He came to the village days ago. He confronted Lionel. He begged him to stop carrying all the guilt alone." Her voice shook. "I couldn't let him ruin it. I didn't mean to shoot him. I only meant to frighten him away." "And when Dr. Forsyth came to the orchard," Miss Marple said softly, "you followed him?" Tears broke at last, streaking down the woman's face. "He looked so hopeful, so ready to be forgiven. I couldn't bear it. My sister did not get forgiveness. She got a grave." Her voice cracked. "I fired before I even knew what I was doing." Miss Marple stepped close enough now to see the trembling in every line of the woman's posture. "And afterward, when Edwin ran to the woods, you thought he might discover what Ralph knew, or whom he met. You thought to silence him too." "I didn't want to hurt Edwin," she cried. "I love that boy. I helped raise him after my sister died, but he shouldn't know. He shouldn't carry this." "You cannot unmake grief," Miss Marple murmured, "but neither can you write it with blood." Mrs. Dalrymple's strength seemed to ebb all at once. Her hand wavered. The pistol slipped from her fingers and fell softly into the moss at her feet. She covered her face with trembling hands. Inspector Graves moved swiftly, securing the weapon and stepping behind her. He spoke with more gentleness than might be expected. "Mrs. Dalrymple, it's over. Come quietly now." She did not resist. As Graves led her from the clearing, Edwin and Ralph, wounded but conscious, watched with hollow expressions. Edwin swayed slightly, struggling to reconcile the woman he had trusted with the truth laid bare. Miss Marple approached him. "She lost more than she could bear," Miss Marple said gently. "But that does not make her actions just. Grief, Edwin dear, is a poor guide when left unattended." Edwin's voice shook. "I can't believe she would do this. I can't believe she hated him enough." Miss Marple gave a sad smile. "Oh, hatred rarely burns alone. It travels with love. Grief binds them, and guilt stirs them, and before long, the lines blur until the heart no longer knows which it follows. The inspector's constable signaled that Ralph was ready to be moved. Graves nodded, then turned to Miss Marple with a quiet look of gratitude. "You saw the pattern long before the rest of us," he said. "Oh no, Inspector," she said modestly. "I merely watched people. They reveal far more than footprints or torn fabric ever could." Graves gave a weary chuckle. "You may be the only person in England who calls murder a matter of observing people." Miss Marple tilted her head, amusement whispering through her eyes. "People commit murder, Inspector. It is only logical to begin with them." They made their slow way from the woods, the sun dipping lower as the village's evening bells began to ring. Ralph was taken to the infirmary, Mrs. Dalrymple to the station, and Edwin returned to his stepmother with a heart laden but no longer haunted by suspicion. Later, as the village settled into whispers that would soon weave themselves into rumor, Miss Marple sat with a cup of warm tea in Mrs. Faversham's sitting room. Judith, pale but steadier than before, watched her with profound gratitude. "You saved us all," Judith murmured. "Oh, I shouldn't say that," Miss Marple replied, stirring her tea. "I merely helped the truth find its way to daylight. It likes to do that, you know, especially when people try very hard to bury it." Judith exhaled a shuddering breath. "Will Edwin ever recover from this?" "Time," Miss Marple said gently, "cures what justice cannot reach. And Edwin is stronger than you think." Judith looked toward the window, where the twilight painted the orchard in soft gray. "I suppose you're right, though I wish none of this had happened." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "In villages, my dear, people imagine quiet lives, but quiet lives conceal the loudest hearts, and hearts, even the gentlest, can be pressed to desperate acts." Judith nodded, wiping a tear. "Thank you, Miss Marple." Miss Marple rested her hand on Judith's. "Be kind to yourself, and even kinder to Edwin." Later still, as Miss Marple walked alone toward the guest cottage where she was staying, the cool air rustled the leaves overhead. The village was returning to its familiar rhythms, closing windows, setting lamps aglow, settling into its routines as though murder had never passed through its gardens. But Miss Marple knew that beneath every roof, every whispered conversation, hearts were shifting, some with guilt, some with relief, some with sorrow. Villages remembered everything. She paused at the lane's end, looking back once toward Mrs. Faversham's orchard, now peaceful again in the dimming light. "Human nature," she murmured, "is always the same story, told in endlessly different ways." Then, with a small, thoughtful smile, she continued down the path, leaving little Brackley to its healing, and its secrets once more tucked politely beneath its tranquil surface.